Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to get a break from Bathsheba stuff. I've heard some inordinate nonsense written and spoken in the last week, so to talk about Cambrai makes a nice change. Okay, so I've been asked to talk about artillery. I'm going to take a slightly broader remit than just the battle itself, and I'll talk a little bit about artillery developments in 1917 because they're important to understanding the use of artillery at Cambrai as well. So that's the title, and because I have a flippant streak, oh yeah, turn that on, that always helps. Woo! It's all coming together now, sort of, as my flippant subtitle. So what you do get at the end of 1917 is things finally starting to come together for both sides. They are starting to figure out the tactical solutions to the problems that they have been facing for the better half of 3 years. Okay, so what I'll look at first is I'll just talk a little bit, an important point I'd like to make about learning adaptation on the Western Front. Then I'll talk about British artillery developments, a bit about German artillery developments, and then I'll talk about the British attack, and then I'll talk about the German counterattack. If you're not familiar with the Battle of Cambrai, basically it's in broad terms it's a seesaw. British make an attack, very successful. The Germans counterattack, pretty much about the same success going the other way, and the end, I guess, is broadly speaking a draw. So everyone goes away going, some things worked, some things didn't. And then right at the end I've got a slide to sort of just bring out some of the key points, I hope. Okay, learning adaptation on the Western Front is no army is operating in isolation. The British are learning from the French are learning from the British, both of them are learning from the Germans, and the Germans are learning from the other side as well. Not just in regards to artillery tactics, but also in regards to infantry, the whole gamut of military operations. It also extends to the Eastern Front. Indeed, part of the British planning for what happens at Cambrai is influenced by occurrences on the Eastern Front and information that they're getting from the Russians about what the Germans have been doing over there. So just bear that in mind. It's not, and in Australia, we tend to be very focused on the Australian experience for good reasons. When we get beyond that, we tend to think about the BEF. Beyond that, we don't think about much very often. The French in particular, they're just these weird guys off to the right. The French army is absolutely fundamental to understanding what's going on the Western Front, and the British army learns a lot from the French. The American army, when it shows up, will learn even more. Don't use the lens of 1940 to understand the French in the First World War. Okay, so what are some of the key British? I can't go through them all. I've only got 15 to 20 minutes, so I'm going to just stick to what I think the highlights are. Everything that's going on is building on the lessons of the war thus far, particularly for the British, what's happened in 1916 on the Somme. The process of learning adaptation in the war basically starts the first day of the war. In 1915, everybody is trying to start to figure out solutions. The problem is, to a large extent, is nobody has the resources to affect what they think might be a solution. They don't have the shell capacity, they don't have enough guns. By 1915, everyone's figured out we need more guns. The armies don't have them yet. The British and French in particular don't have enough heavy guns. The Germans have got more heavy guns, not because they're geniuses, but because in 1914, or before the war, their military problem involves reducing French and Belgian forts. So they have many more heavy guns. So in 1915, lots of futile battles. Not much is really going on in terms of learning it. There is learning adaptation, but it's very much hampered. Once you get into 1916, particularly for the British, this is really the first year that they're in the war big time. Up until now, they've been building up the BEF. They fight the Battle of the Somme, and they start learning lots of lessons, and to give them the credit, they start trying to apply those lessons, develop solutions from the problems that they've faced. And what factors into that as well is the French experience at Verdun. So over the winter of 1916, 1917, new doctrine starts coming out. That's just one example up there, artillery and offensive operations, but there's other stuff as well. Now, the command and control issue, or lesson of the First World War, or what happens, is for the infantry, it's about devolution. It's pushing command downwards and giving more authority and capacity to platoon commanders and company commanders. By 1917, the end of 1917, it's a lot about devolved infantry tactics. Now, that doesn't say that ultimate planning, of course, is part of much larger headquarters and organisations, but on the battlefield, it's pushing it down. In the artillery, it's the other way. It's more about pushing command responsibilities up and increased centralisation. So by 1917 in the British Army, a lot of it is going on at the corps level, corps and army level. And the establishment of the GOCRA, General Officer Commanding Royal Artillery and Corps Headquarters, is the key sort of command facilitation of this. Also established at corps level is the CBSO, Counter Battery Staff Officer, known colloquially as the counterblaster. And there's one of those in every headquarters. He doesn't actually command guns, but he becomes the guru of counter battery fire. And he's obviously liaising with the other gunners in the headquarters, the other senior gunners, getting the resources that he requires, and counter battery fire just becomes this ongoing task that the artillery grapple with. When it comes to undertaking offensives, there's the development of artillery groups and commanders, so divisional artillery becomes less important in a sense because it's increasingly being controlled at corps level. So, and what's part of that is actually the divisional artillery start to lose guns. And batteries are taken out of divisional artilleries and they're put into army field artillery brigades, which can be just moved around as required. For everybody, although the British do stand out as something of a model, there's increasing technical sophistication. Things like meteorology start to come into play. Surveying, gun calibration, and believe it or not, the creation of gun tables. So you can actually have some written down tabulated data about how the guns that you have will perform in certain circumstances when you do certain things with the guns. Before the war, field artillery in particular, it's almost an instinctive thing. Yeah, indirect fire has been used before, but artillery officers are considered sort of horsey, if you like, because there's a horsed arm. And it's all about galloping out there, unlimbering, looking at the hill over there, estimating the range and popping off a few rounds and adjusting without too much technicalities. Mortars become much more ubiquitous, much more reliable, the 6-inch Newton mortar. Believe it or not, until 1917, there's no such thing as a smoke shell in the British Army. In 1917, they get them and they start using them. Gas is ubiquitous. And of course, good old sound ranging, which you've probably heard of. By the end of 1917, lots of U-Butte fine instruments. They can pinpoint German guns down to about 25 yards. And of course, once you've got that intelligence, you can use that for your counter battery stuff. Flash spotting factors into that too. Now in 1916, when you use the artillery, you just tried to cream everything. Just destroy it. Oh look, there's a line of blockhouses, let's pound it for days on end and eventually we'll turn it into dust. Well, they shift away from that in 1917 and it's more towards barrages. They shift away from destruction and towards neutralisation. And one of the reasons they can do that is because the infantry starting to get new equipment, new tactics, new doctrine, is increasingly able to actually fight its own way across no man's land. Yes, the artillery is absolutely vital, but the guys with Lewis guns and Mills bombs can actually take care of themselves to a much greater extent. So that means the artillery is actually there to facilitate that more, hence the shift to barrages. And as part of that, the heavies basically get set aside for counter battery fire and what is left to destruction tasks, And all field artillery basically becomes for the purposes of barrages. So that's creeping barrages, standing barrages, box barrages, the various types. And believe it or not, this will be bread and butter for everybody here, I'm sure, but in 1917, superimposition is a new tactic as well. So you now have that reserve of fire that you can move around the battlefield as required. Now on the German side, look, in broad terms, it's actually a kind of a mirror image. Yes, it's different because it's a different army, they have a different approach, but they're going through the same sorts of processes and just coming up with their own solutions to the same problems to a large extent. Again, they're building on their own lessons, particularly from Verdun, the Somme as well, and also what's going on the Eastern Front. A lot of the stuff that's written about the Germans tends to focus on individuals. When it comes to artillery, talking about George Bruchmüller, he's undoubtedly an important character, but I think our understanding of the institutional response to this is still a bit superficial, to be honest. The Germans don't go for corps headquarters very much. For them, it's basically division headquarters reporting to army headquarters, which works well enough, broadly speaking, but when a divisional headquarters gets saddled with extra tasks, they tend to buckle under the load. So suddenly if you're a divisional artillery headquarters and you're given a whole bunch of extra resources, extra batteries, etc., command and control becomes a problem. But broadly speaking, they're increasingly centralised command and control as well, and shifting towards intricate planning, as are the British. Technically, the Germans have renowned for their technical skills, but I was kind of amazed to read that for the Germans, they're actually doing sound ranging with ear horns. It's probably accurate enough, but nowhere near what the British are doing, all the fine instruments the British are creating. The Germans are not doing the same. The French have the instruments as well. Meteorology, gas, calibration, gun tactics, gun tables, same sorts of stuff that the British are doing. The Germans have never been ones for really big, long preparatory bombardments. Before the Battle of Verdun, their bombardment was 10 hours, that was it, whereas the Somme for the British just went for ages. So the Germans maintain an emphasis on surprise, and because of the technical stuff that's going on, there's a shift towards not using preparatory bombardments. And the reason they can do this is because they've developed silent registration. They can shoot off the map. And this is where the Eastern Front comes in, because a lot of the stuff they've been developing on the Eastern Front. Creeping barrages as well. And because they're shifting to stormtrooper tactics, infantry are going forward with small guns that they're sort of pulling behind, and Minenwerfer, that's trench mortars, and using that as well. So there's a kind of a layering of the firepower. Okay, so at Cambrai, what's the British plan? Well, they're building on the developments of Arras, Messines and Third Ypres, which are battles that have occurred earlier in the year. This is going to be a two-corps attack against the Germans through a raid in depth on the Hindenburg line, and the British are going to have 400 tanks and about 1,000 guns. It's a quiet sector for the Germans, so there's average quality infantry, no reserves, and the guns they've got are mostly old or ones they've captured from somewhere along the way. Now the British are also going to go for some surprise here, no preparatory bombardments. And the reason they can do that is because they have tanks. That, combined with the 106 fuse, which is a U-boot fuse that you can use to cut wire, means that there's less need to conduct a big preparatory bombardment, because the tanks will go forward. If you can cut it at short notice with a 106 fuse on a shell, or you can send a tank forward to crush it, so less need for preparatory fire. It means you can return to surprise, so hence the firing off the map using silent registration. Surprisingly, at Cambrai, they're not using a creeping barrage. Again, because they're going to surprise, they're not worried about the Germans getting out of their trenches and occupying shell holes, which means they don't need to fire a creeping barrage. So at Cambrai, they're actually going to shift back to a lifting barrage, firing a one trench line, moving to the next trench line as per a timetable. Big benefit is it doesn't churn up the ground, and that will help the tanks and the infantry and guns when they need to move forward. There's a certain amount of devolution because there's an anticipation of a breakthrough. So they actually start allocating field artillery batteries and even a few heavy batteries down to infantry units. They can actually go forward when the breakthrough happens. About a third of the guns are going to be used for counter battery. They're going to neutralise OPs with smoke and attack the command and control by shelling headquarters, telephone exchanges, etc. And because they're worried about anti-tank guns, they'll also have a plan for that. That's a barrage. This is a barrage map for Cambrai done after the battle, so for a history. So but it gives you an idea of what's sort of going on. Now, basically, what happens in the battle is it goes really well to start with. But some of the tanks get knocked out, or the tanks start getting knocked out. The British don't take all the positions, and particularly, they can't deal with this ridge up here around Flesquier, where the Germans stand fast, so they've got a whole bunch of anti-tank guns up there, and they really pound the tanks. They lose a large number of tanks, and the attack starts to bog down. The British keep pushing on in subsequent days, but what happens essentially is what happens all over the Western Front throughout the war. Things go great on the first day, the enemy rush in reinforcements, you lose the element of surprise, and your assaults on the second day, because you're also running off a much shorter cycle of preparing and executing a plan, don't go as well, and things start to break down. There we go, we're running out. Right, okay, I'll get through the rest quickly. So within a couple of days, this has all come to a bit of a halt. The Germans counterattack on the 30th of November, and the Germans amass infantry and artillery using good use of operational security. They're moving at night. They've got a bit of air superiority, but there's also poor weather, which means the Brits can't see what's going on. And they're trying to pinch out the salient. And the GHQ, British GHQ, doesn't really know. For some reason, just doesn't pay attention to what's going on. The Germans attack using these hurricane bombardment. Lots of guns. German counter-battery fire is pretty terrible, particularly in the north. And then using those infantry infiltration tactics and using the guns and Minenwerfer to help reduce strong points. Big advances in the south. They kind of fail in the north. Brits lose lots of guns, but as usual, the British respond. Same problem on the Western Front. Send reinforcements and the line stabilises and the battle comes to an end. Okay, so predictive fire is a big success and enables the return to secrecy. The Brits now have enough guns and shells to do all the things they want to do, which is a big logistical and resourcing advantage. Counter battery is really important. Barrages to protect and assess the infantry. The defensive doctrine is found to be a bit dodgy. They need to work on that. And they also need to work on cooperating with guns in the open on the move, because once they started doing that, they had some problems. The Germans continue to abandon linear defences. Their focus on counterattack starts to play into British hands because the British always know they're coming. They set up a barrage to smash it up. But still, the artillery tactics are well proven, and this is the stuff the Germans are going to be using in 1918.